I want us to consider the effect of poorly worded questions. So these two questions are attempting to ask the same thing, but they got very different results. Is our government providing too much money for welfare programs? The response was 44% saying yes. Whereas when the question instead was, is our government providing too much money for assistance to the poor, only 13% said yes. And so even though these two questions are different, they are asking about the same type of thing, and we got very different responses because they affect a different reaction out of the people in the surveys. In the last chapter, we talked about this idea of margin of error, and the margin of error only covers that random sampling error. If you have things like undercoverage, non-response, or other difficulties that can cause a large bias, that's not going to be covered by the margin of error. So essentially, your margin of error cannot overcome bad sampling techniques. Now, we've talked about the idea that we can introduce errors from our sampling, but there are actually other sampling methods that can be valid. We had our simple random sample where each group of size n has the same chance of being selected. But the problem with a simple random sample is that sometimes that random sample is not going to include a cross-section of your population. You may or may not get representatives from different groups that could be interesting to your study. Things like gender, race, income class, or religion all might play a part in the responses, and if you rely simply on our simple random sample, you may not get somebody from each of these groups. So if you were asking the question, do you think our healthcare system works well, you would want to make sure that you had people from different income levels, different age groups, maybe different genders, because all of those groups might have a different response to this question. Some things that we can do to handle our non-sampling errors is that we can substitute other households for the non-responders. So if perhaps you had a household in a particular neighborhood that was selected for study, but they refused to answer or you could not get in touch with them, you could get another response from a similar household. And that's going to be a way to reduce that bias for non-response. Sometimes professional surveys will actually weight the responses in order to correct some of these sources for bias because they recognize things like non-response is going to affect their outcomes. The Current Population Survey, they sample the U.S. households on a regular basis. And one of the things that they do is this idea of sampling in stages. So they have divided the nation into 2007 geographic areas that they call primary sampling units. And there are always going to be 428 highly populated units automatically in their samples. The rest of them are divided into 326 groups, and those are called strata. And these strata are going to share some similarity, and they, as the surveyors, will take one unit from each of the stratum. The purpose of doing that is to ensure that each of these subgroups or strata are represented. They take each of these 754 units in that first stage of the sample and divide them into what's called a census block, which is an even smaller geographic area. They also group those into strata based on things like housing type or minority group, things like that, because they want to make sure that they are getting a cross-section of the entire United States. So each block is arranged in order of their location and divided into groups, and these are called clusters. And so the final sample is going to consist on these clusters not individual households that are from each stratum of blocks. And I know all of that is really complicated, and I want you to recognize that sampling techniques can be quite complicated. But the reason that they go through this much trouble is so that they ensure that all of the different groups in the population are going to be represented in every sample that they take.